sync up with what's happening. We're probably good right about now. So we are finished with our roof project. So that is why we're able to be back in here. It was quite a bit noisy and dust falling from the ceiling and all things like that. So it would not have been a great environment for us to gather over the last couple of weeks. But we're glad to be back doing this, to be gathered together, and also to be gathered together online, maybe at some point in the future as we continue our discussion on the book of Luke. And what I want to do is, especially given the fact that it's been a little while, some people would say the fact that it's been overnight would make it hard to remember what we've talked about over the last session. But particularly because it's been a couple of weeks, I kind of want to take a look back with you all and kind of examine what we've talked about, right? So we're going to do that with the scriptures here, because of course we could go all the way back to talk about all the background. We talked about all the historical context, all the Old Testament history and everything like that we've been discussing and what we've been doing. But I really just want to pay attention to what's happened in the story, right, in terms of getting us caught up. So what's happening in the story, if you remember, Luke 1:1-4, we said is kind of a book sleeve, right? It gives credibility to the author. It tells you what you're about to read and what it's all about. We talked a little bit about who Theophilus was, and why that might matter a little bit for us. The clues that this gives us into what this text is about, namely that you're going to hear this theme a lot, namely that, this story stacks up with the other gospel stories that they would have already heard, and that this story is a continuation of the things that have happened throughout the course of the Old Testament, right? So then we have Luke 5 and 6 and 7. We talked about how this sort of provides a dating and how biblical dating is different than dating today, and so we actually can see what we might call discrepancies and things of that nature in these. And yet, it's just going to depend on who's dating and what their point is. And remember that their main mission is persuasion more than it is the exact historical information. So all of those types of datings and settings are going to influence the writing that they're the point that they're trying to make within their writing. And then perhaps above all else, this starts to set the stage for what's happening next, because it tells us about who Zechariah is, who his wife is, that these are not just normal people. Do you remember talking about that? These people are not just your average, everyday Hebrew people. These are priestly people. These are holy people. And of course, we get the great reversal in verses 6 and 7, right? They were both righteous. Remember, we talked about how that is a repetition. They were righteous. They were blameless. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. I think there's probably a little bit of patriarchy left in this language, because I don't know, of course, back then, they would have had no idea, who really would be at fault in the situation, and unfortunately, culturally, historically, couldn't have been the man's fault, right? So I think we get a little bit of that when it says because Elizabeth was not able to conceive. My science teachers have always taught me it takes two to be able to conceive for the most part. So to kind of pin the blame on one probably is just more about the culture in the historical setting we find ourselves in. But we talk about how that is a reversal of what's to be expected, right? We talked about how the idea of much of the Jewish faith is based on covenant and obedience to the covenant, and if you follow it, which the scripture says they do, and they do so blamelessly, then you are going to reap benefits in this life, namely blessings. In their world, the chief or one of the chief blessings would have been to continue on future generations, to be able to conceive. And so we have a problem here that's being introduced by Luke, right? Now, that's sort of where we finished. So maybe a little bit of foreshadowing here. Maybe we know the story a little bit about what we're going to be talking about. And so now that catches us up to where we are, Luke 1:8-10. It's crazy. I don't know, how many times have we done this? Is this like number 6 or something? And here we are in verse 8. So, but we'll get going, I think, a little bit once we once we get into stories and things of that nature, that may take up an entire clump of time. But today we're going to focus on 8 through 10. We may get past it, we may not, but that's kind of just what I want to focus on for now. And here's what it says. I'm reading from the NIV here. It says, once when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. So Zechariah, we've already mentioned, is a priest. It is sort of his turn to be serving, and he was chosen by lot. We'll talk about what that means and the significance of that here in a second. It says that that's custom among the priesthood, which of course it was. To go into the temple, he's going to burn incense. We're going to talk about what that means again. And when the time of burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. Remember last time we said when we look at a section, it's a good thing for us to read it twice, and that's basically just what we've done, and to lead you into what we might be talking about here in a second. So, we're going to start here, and we stop where we stop because it sets the scene for for the events that are taking place and what's going to take place moving into the future. All right, so it talks about here, Zechariah's division was on duty, and he was serving as a priest before God. What is Zechariah's division? What does that mean? Well, it's pretty simple. It was mentioned earlier what priestly order he belonged to, and at different times, different orders would serve at the temple. So, does that make sense? So you had different orders from different families, and they were appointed to serve at the temples throughout various occasions. Now remember, the temple, there's the name. I don't know. I made the font way too small. If you're watching online, I apologize. You guys can probably barely even read that here in person. But his order, his division was Abijah, and they all had just various names that define them in their order. But basically, his group of priests that he belonged to, it was their turn to be serving at the temple. Now remember, the temple is different, operates differently than the church, right? The church we call the house of God, more so because of what happens here more than who lives here, right? We do not believe in the Christian faith that this is the place where God resides. No, because of the Holy Spirit, we believe that God's presence is accessible to us all over the place. That was not the case in the Jewish tradition. The temple was the literal household of God. It is where God dwelt. If you were with us in worship on Sunday, we talked about the tabernacle. Do you remember that? And the tabernacle literally means dwelling. It literally means to dwell. The tabernacle was mobile, and once the Israelites' position was established here in Jerusalem, God instructed, it was King David who God instructed to build this temple, and that became the permanent housing place of God where God dwelt. Only priests could fulfill the duties on the holy days that we're learning about. It wasn't as if we're going to look at a map of it, you have it here in a second, about different places different people could go. It didn't operate the same way the church does. There's no place in this church building that people who belong to our congregation can't go. It might be a little weird if someone's digging around the janitor's closet or something on Sunday morning or whatever, but theoretically speaking, there's no place that's too holy for one person or another, right? It's not the case what's happening here inside of this temple. In ordinary time, which is what we see here, they would be separated on a rotating basis, the priests would, based on their division of when it was that division's turn to be leading events in the temple. And it says that they would cast lots. You see that? So we talked about his division, how it was their turn to be serving as priests, and that he was chosen by lot. Here's what that means. It was believed to, if you cast lots, basically think of it as a roll of the die or whatever else, in an effort to make a selection of whose turn it was seen by them as a way to get their human influence out of the way and to give God control over that situation. Does that make sense? So we might call it leaving it up to chance. They would say God was in the midst of that process making the selection. And here through this story, we can see that they were right? That throughout the story, we're finding that God did not just select a priest for this day, for this event to happen to. God wanted Zechariah. God wanted Zechariah. right? And so they would cast lots for specific duties because this worked around human will and human behavior and human organization and allowed God to speak. That's another major theme of this section here, is listening to God when God speaks. So Luke is then affirming that God was choosing Zechariah for this time. I think maybe that is spoken specifically of the casting of lots to make it for certain in Luke's viewpoint that Zechariah was chosen for this duty and for this very moment in time. It also mentions that what would the priest go in there to do? He was chosen by lot according to the custom of the priesthood to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense, right? His job would be to burn incense offering in the morning and in the evening. And because of this duty, as well as the occasional nature of the priest's opportunity to do this, it was the highest honor that they could have, apart from what's called the Day of Atonement, which we'll talk about here in a second. This was part of the purity laws of Judaism. The history of the burning of incense is long, and they do it for a variety of reasons. In this case, because I want to look at verse 10, when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. I would say that the main purpose of the burning of incense here is as a prayer aid. What was believed, the prayers of the people would go, the incense would burn, and it would lift to the heavens. Do you see that? Capturing the prayers of the people and taking them to heaven. That's how it's believed as a prayer aid. You have incense offering, which it's used for atonement and other things of that nature, but I think Luke at least wants to place the emphasis on this being a time of prayer, that the prayers of the people are being lifted, that God might hear them, right? So that's what's happening. So if we say, what's the burning of incense deal? We would need to do a lot of Jewish history to talk about the whole history of the burning of incense, but I think in this instance, especially since Luke says when the time specifically came for the burning of incense, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. I think that's really important. Yeah.
Zechariah was burning incense in the morning and in the evening.
Mm-hmm.
He was there all day, doing his duty all day.
Right. I mean, he would what we're going to find is they would still come out because the priests were mediators between the people and God. So it doesn't make any sense that they would not come out and share with the people. So it wouldn't necessarily be that he was in the temple day and night. It would just be that they had ritualistic times that they would specifically burn the incense. But he would still be appointed for that day and that time, right? So that's how that operated. Because God, well, this is going to make more sense when we talk about what the temple looked like and how it operated. But God wanted to dwell with people, but had to remain separate. Why? Sinless, sinful. The people who were appointed as priests, holier than the average Jewish worshiper, who were very devout, but these people were chosen by God to enter into, to be as close as possible to God's presence. So their job was to take what's happening in here and take what's happening out here and bring them together, right? So they're a representation of what's happening outside. That's what's so important about why Luke throughout this is saying the people outside, the people outside. Here in a few verses, we're going to see, Luke is going to say Zechariah went back out to talk to the people. So we see this really, a lot of emphasis going on between this individual person and the masses. And that's really important. We're going to talk about, what I mean by that here in a second. So that's what we see here. We see God choosing Zechariah. We're going to learn about the temple a little bit, and we see Zechariah's division happening here. So here is the temple. I know it's confusing. If it's online, it's turned sideways. The reason I did that is because if I turned it vertical, it would get too small and you couldn't really see it. So I found it easier to turn it and you can kind of just read sideways. If you're here in person, you have a paper copy because that's going to be even easier for you all to see than I think even looking at the big screen here. So check that out. It's sort of a map of the interior of a Jewish temple, if you will. Now, do you see the very outside, the dark lines that create the rectangle around the outside? Those are the temple gates. Do you see that? All the gates are marked. So this is not 100% interior. Do you understand? What's interior is the really dark rectangle inside. Do you see where it says the Holy of Holies and all of that? That's an interior temple. And what's happening around it is temple courts and chambers and things like that. So the place, the place where it's white around that, do you see the steps at the bottom there? Around that, you can see that would be basically like a courtyard. And the courtyards had different purposes. You even see a division between the outer court and the priestly court there on the inside. Now, where we want to draw our attention to specifically, we're not going to talk about every aspect of this map. We don't need to, nor would I be able to tell you about every single aspect of this map. But what I want to draw our attention to is the Holy of Holies. Do you see it? It's inside. It's all the way inside. The Holy of Holies, that is the specific dwelling place of Yahweh. Remember how we talked about the temple is where God dwells, and yet there's separation between the people and God? The Holy of Holies is where God dwells. It's where the Ark of the Covenant is held. The Ten Commandments, the tablets of the Ten Commandments historically, traditionally, are inside of the Ark of the Covenant, or were inside the Ark of the Covenant. Right? So that is God's dwelling place. That space could only be entered by a high priest on one day of the year. One day of the year. To the Jewish people, it is called the Day of Atonement. We might recognize the term Yom Kippur, however we want to say it, in terms of sort of our experience with the Jewish tradition. That may be a holiday we recognize more than the phrase Day of Atonement, which sounds really dark. But that's their holiday. And the reason that that's special is because that is the Day of Atonement, the special day where a special sacrifice was made to atone for the sins of the priest and the priesthood and all of the people. It's a culmination of a 10-day season of repentance that begins with Rosh Hashanah and the action of God being purification of people individually and collectively. Does that sound familiar to you? What does it sound like within the Methodist tradition? Think of a season that ends in sacrifice in our tradition. That's right, Lent. That's right. That season is marked by repentance and ends in sacrifice. Do you see? A lot of our Christian traditions are founded in this same rhythm of life. So God isn't all about creating something totally and entirely new. God is making new things out of old things often. Do you see the comparison there too? That the sacrifice that happens at the end of the season is atonement for the people. And throughout that season, we focus on repentance, our need for that atonement, our need for that sacrifice, and the action of God specifically being purification of people individually and collectively. Now, we don't really use the term purification, but if you want to think about it that way, that sacrifice of Jesus is our ability to maintain pure hearts, at least in the eyes of God, if not in the eyes of man. You can see the comparison that's happening here. Now, just outside the Holy of Holies, there are a couple of arrows pointing to this space. Do you see them? I think it says Holy Place, and it says Incense Altar. See those? That's where Zechariah would have been. You see that? Think of that. Now, the temple doesn't operate in the same way that the church does. We've talked about that already. But think about that like an altar, right, in terms of this space. It's where the leader of these people is doing their business. So when it talks about the burning of this incense, the burning of the incense would have happened inside that holy place. The reason it's there is because it is as close as you can get to the Holy of Holies without being in the Holy of Holies. Make sense? There's still separation between God and the priest, between God and people, but we are offering these prayers as close to the presence of God as possible. Right? We talked a little bit about how that is the structure of the inside of the temple, and then you sort of have courts and chambers that surround that, and walls that surround all of those with various gates and things like that. If you go to Jerusalem, you can still see many of those gates. Some of them are filled, and some of them you can still walk through into the temple. They're often marked, And so that's just a cool note. And so here, what I thought I'd show you is to show you that this is not some ancient place that we know nothing of anymore. It's still there. There's an image right there of the temple courts in Jerusalem on your screen there. So that's a picture I took in 2019. So this place is not foreign. The temple is destroyed. It was destroyed in 70 AD, and I'll show you that in a second. But this is where it would have been. And also, if you're aware of sort of your geographical history here, this is a spot that's been fought over for centuries between multiple faith traditions, right? And so something you might recognize. Well, turn around this way. It shows you more of sort of these temple courts of where this particular temple, this is second temple here, would have resided, all right? Now, that might be an image that you recognize a little bit more from where this is, right? So that is the Dome of the Rock. That is you know what, friends? My Islamic understanding is slim. I believe that is the second holiest site in Islam, the first being Mecca, right? But that is a house of worship and prayer for the Islamic tradition, and it is on top of that spot. Now, it's not specifically on top of the spot where it was believed that the second temple would have existed, but it would have happened. Remember these courtyards? It's sort of within this connected area. Does that make sense? All those gates enter into this large area with a bunch of courtyards, and so that would have been not right on top of where that Holy of Holies was, but in the same courtyard.
You told us the second.
Mm-hmm.
Would that been built by Solomon?
Oh, not the Dome of the Rock. No. Oh, you're talking about the second temple?
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. So, and it, of course, added onto by various leaders. Herod added onto this temple quite a bit. Usually, if it was added onto by non-Jews, it was just to earn favor. That's why Herod did most things for the Jews, is just to merit their favor.
The people were out here.
Uh-huh. Right. Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm amazed at how large this area is. I
Yeah.
had no idea.
Yeah. But think about it as all, I mean, you can see it's all a worship space. It's all a gathering space. It's not a place where you come in and hear a sermon necessarily, but you can see that, you have courtyards and chambers and things like that where people are all going. So it's a big space. Yeah, it's not a temple in our modern comprehension of that. If you go into parts of our state and into our nation where you can find a Jewish temple, we think of it similar to a church. You know what I mean? It's a building where people of that tradition go and they worship and they pray. But this is a totally different deal. And this would have been unlike anything else. I mean, it was adorned. It was very impressive. So that gives you a little bit of idea of that. I just want to show you that picture because that shot might be a little bit more familiar than, say, like that, right? That shot of Jerusalem there, and it's a little bit stretched out because I wanted to fill the picture, but that might be a more familiar image there. Those are rocks from the destruction of that temple in 70 AD. Is that unbelievable? They're still there. You can go and visit them. You can touch them. It's insane. I mean, that is when that temple came crumbling down. That is part of that still left there, as evidence of when this was destroyed. This particular temple was destroyed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that, it was just said that it was just a reminder of the reality of some of the stuff that we talk about. And that's, I think, what I get so impacted by when I make a trip to the Holy Lands and things of that nature, is that so much of the stuff we read about just comes to life. And that's why in sermons and in teachings, I try to show pictures of my experience as much as I can to bring that still to people today who understand there's a geographic location about, where some of this stuff happens in Israel and in Greece and in Rome, and yet the reality of it, I think, still escapes us into modernity. And to live in a nation where if we have a structure that's 200 years old, I mean, our jaws drop, right? We're like, holy smokes, this house was built in, around the Civil War. And you go to Europe and Asia, and they're like, yeah, that was built in like the 4th century, It's just unbelievable. And so you see a lot of that in Israel as well, in different parts where the stones you're walking on are the same stones that were there when Jesus was there. It's just inspiring. This might also be a site that you recognize. This is around the temple. That's called the Western Wall, also known as the Wailing Wall. This is a place, a traditional place for Jewish prayer. The reason that this wall is special is because it is as close as you can get to the place of the Holy of Holies. That's why. So of all the places that they pray, this is why this one would be most famous, is because it's as close as you can get. And actually, do you see the little archway in there? You can go in there. It is uncomfortable, in my opinion, for someone who is not of that tradition to be in there because you're in and out because you don't want to be distracting to people who are in there praying. But in there, you can find the most of Orthodox priests that are operating today because that is even closer to the exact location of it. And as you can imagine, in this space, if you've ever been there, you recognize there was much hubbub about it. Actually, I believe most recently, Vice President Pence visited this location. And just for the media and things like that, they actually require, there's a space that you're seeing right now for men. And if you were to go underneath this picture, it's separated by a barrier, and that is the space for women to pray. And there's a big hubbub around that. And that still exists, so you can see even inside that, particularly inside that archway, those are male rabbinic priests in there pretty much exclusively, other than yahoos like me that are in there just to see what's going on. So anyways, that gives you a little bit of picture about today and about the history of that, and that when we're talking about this temple and what Zechariah is doing, it's not gone by the wayside. I mean, we can see where these people would have been, right? So that was probably way more information than anybody bargained for about any of that, but I hope it helps us understand the Jewish tradition and how God was active in this time and speaking through those methods, and how God is a part of this particular movement, and how, again, Luke wants to communicate this is through the old movement, this is through the old covenant, this is through the Jewish tradition that God is bringing about something new, right? It's not forget it. God says, I'm doing something new. It's out of that old thing that God is bringing about a new thing, right? So the most important part that we can say is, as far as Zechariah's story, Zechariah is closer to the presence of God than anyone can get outside of that Day of Atonement. And he's at that incense altar, like we mentioned, and only some priests could do this. Only some priests could do this, a part of a certain division, a part of a certain order, and you had to be the winner of the lots, right? You had to be chosen by God to go in there, in their minds. No non-priests could ever go in there. Ever. Can you imagine the mystery? Right? Today, it would be ruined by our ability to share images and things like that. There would be less mystery. No? What goes on in there? What does it look like? So you can imagine the reverence that would come from the people to the priests who were allowed to go in there. Right? Now, that does not make the people on the outside non-faithful people, non-committed people, people who are not still chosen by God. They're just not chosen by God for this specific task. The people outside that are praying and worshiping, those are faithful Jews, right? But Luke wants to make it clear that Zechariah is appointed especially by God, not just for this role, but for this specific moment in time. This thing that God is going to do. Okay? All right, so now a couple of other important notes about this small section. You mentioned, talked about this first item a little bit before, Bob, but the mention and the interplay between Zechariah and the crowd of people provide hints that the events that are happening inside that temple that we haven't quite read about yet, right? We're just leading up to it. But the events that are going to happen inside that temple have repercussions beyond just Zechariah. It's about all of these people that what God is doing is going to influence. You see that? God has chosen Zechariah to enter this, but the people are a constant focus in this story. If it was just about Zechariah, why mention the people, right? If this was only about Zechariah and Elizabeth and their family and how God is going to move in them, then who cares about what's happening with all those people? Luke wants to say it matters a lot because this is not just about them, it's about all of them. So it's about the priests and the people. Two, we talked about this already, it's a continuation of the Old Testament. You know, in this story, we're going to talk about a theme that Luke focuses on, this theme that Luke focuses on a lot. And Luke is beginning his story with a holy Jewish practice. Do you see why that matters? If Luke wants to make a point that this is a continuation of the Old Testament and God's movement throughout the history of time, that's where we start. We see Gospels like the Gospel of John does not begin with any such narrative, does he? It says, in the beginning was the Word became flesh. That's it. That is a nod to the Jewish tradition, right? Because the Word is God's creation agent. It's who we understand God to be. And he says, that God became flesh. That's it. Because John was written much later, and so the focuses and the needs of that gospel are different than Luke's. But he starts with a holy Jewish practice. And so that's important because it gives credibility for this story. That this is not a separate deity talking to this group of people about a new movement that's being created. It gives credibility for who John the Baptist is, ultimately Zechariah's son, right? And then ultimately that means it gives credibility for, more importantly than that, who Jesus is. It verifies that this is the same God. It validates all of those practices that are leading up to this moment. That who John the Baptist is prophesying when he says, prepare ye the way of the Lord, the kingdom of God is among you. He's talking about Jesus. And this is the same God that John declares that's done all of this. That's taken care of the Israel people. That selected Zechariah for this moment and selected John the Baptist for this moment. And God isn't speaking out of left field. God is speaking out of practices that he has designed as holy throughout time. God is continuing to speak by speaking something new out of something old, right? And in verse 10, we see that all the worshipers are outside praying. We mentioned this already. Because it was only within the priest's rights to enter. I mentioned that too. The people who are not allowed in are being faithful in the way that they can. Praying for divine intervention on behalf of the nation of Israel, probably praying for their own personal prayer needs as well. That they would be forgiven, that they would be blessed. Which is another big theme that Luke hits on time and time again. Prayer precedes divine intervention. We haven't gotten quite yet to the divine intervention part of the story, but it's important for us to talk about it before we get there. Prayer is preceding a movement from God in this story. Do you see the interchange between God is moving first, the people are responding, and then God responds? God moves first. How? By selecting Zechariah for this moment, for changing Zechariah's life. And the people are being faithful in prayer, and God is going to respond to those prayers of his people. Right? So the priests would burn incense inside the temple, and then they would walk out to the steps of the temple and share God's blessing upon them. Sometimes it would be a specific vision that they would have, a specific prophecy that God would share with them, but oftentimes it was very similar to what you would even see in modern day church in terms of, we've done the religious rite, now I'm going to go out and bless the people. Make sense? It's not necessarily a specific, this is what God told me. It could be, and it would be, but not necessarily every time. So they would offer the incense, walk out of the steps that Zechariah is doing, share God's blessing with the people. So, of course, it's not odd that Zechariah, being who he is, that we would find him serving in the temple in this way. Okay? All right. So I told you we might make it past it. I think we will. It's 12:43, so we've only been rolling for about 34 minutes here, so we got some time to work through this. So then we move on to Luke 11 and 12. Then an angel of the Lord. Remember, so now, just for the sake of all the discussion that we've had before, if we go back to verse 10, it just says he's about to burn the incense. The people are outside praying, but we're still with Zechariah there inside the temple. Right? The angel of the Lord appeared to him standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. So Luke wants to continue to reiterate that this story is happening inside the sanctuary, inside the temple. Why is this so important?
It's also happening in the Holy of Holies.
Well, it's happening out of the incense. See, it was then an angel of the Lord appeared to him standing at the right side of the altar of incense, which would be just outside the Holy of Holies. So the reason that it's important for Luke to make sure that there's emphasis to understand where this is happening is because that is as close to the dwelling place of God as you can get, and God is speaking out of it. Make sense? This isn't some other deity talking. This isn't some other random instance of some vision of some angel. This is a message from Yahweh, the God of Israel. What is happening here is happening within the faith tradition of God's chosen people. And this can't be overstated because it doesn't mean that God couldn't speak in some other way. We know that, right? If God wanted to speak in some other way, God can speak in whatever way God so chooses. No? But it's important because it would be unlikely for these people to believe that this has anything to do with them if it doesn't come out of their tradition in which God has designed. You see that? Whether it's a faith leader or not, they would say, okay, great, what's that got to do with us? If this is happening inside of the sanctuary, inside this temple, that's going to carry some weight for the people. This must be real. This story could easily fall flat on its face if not interwoven to the people of Israel and the Jewish faith. So now let's look at it. It says it's standing at the right side of the altar. Standing at the right side of the altar. Is Luke just really descriptive, or is there a point even to that? What happens at the right side of anything? What is typically understood to be what the right side means? Think about my right-hand man, right? So the right side is a place of honor, traditionally speaking. If you sit to the right of somebody, that's where that expression right-hand man comes from. This is a guy that's always with me. This guy has a place of honor in my life. So to the right of the altar, we're going even further into this story. Not only are we inside the temple, not only are we inside the sanctuary, not only are we on the altar of incense, we're at the right side of it, a place of honor out of which this angel speaks. So let's talk about angels really briefly. This won't be our focus for this time, but it's important to fill in on what is an angel. Yeah, so an angel is a spiritual being that is a messenger for God. They appear in a variety of instances. They appear in a variety of ways, even. And this idea of angels of Yahweh or angels of the Lord is all over the Old Testament. See, you and I, we only think about them in the New Testament, don't we? This story, Mary, Revelation, all this stuff. That's when we think about angels. Maybe rightfully so. We're Christians. But it's all over the Old Testament. So these are spiritual beings created by God, but they serve the purpose of being messengers. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Can you think of any angels in the Old Testament? Can you think of any angels in the Old Testament? Yeah, Gabriel was there. Yeah, so this is actually we're going to hear. In a couple of verses, Gabriel's going to say his name, and this is Gabriel. But Gabriel is found in the Old Testament. I know specifically in Daniel. I couldn't tell you wherever else. One instance is more likely more well-known than another. An angel appears in the burning bush, speaks to Moses, right? Now, it's important to know that there are other kinds of angels. There are different angels using different purposes. The Bible uses other language, like an angel, it says sent by God. But this idea here in this story, an angel of God, is different than that even. An angel of the Lord specifically, in the Hebrew understanding of things, of which is mentioned here, right? Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him. The idea of the angel of the Lord is the royal glory of Yahweh. I don't love the gendered terms that we have, but we don't have any other options. It is the royal glory of Yahweh himself appearing as a human. Okay? It's described in the Old Testament as a glorified human sitting on a throne. That doesn't mean it would appear exactly that way in this case, because the angel of the Lord in its depiction is left undescribed, other than that it's there and that it's at the right hand of the altar. But why would God choose to appear? There are tons of mediums to share this message. Why would God choose to appear through this medium, or in the medium of a burning bush in the Moses narrative? Why would God choose to use this method? Okay, yeah, for sure. Yes, absolutely. That what's happening here is coming from God himself. So we're emphasizing beyond simply this is an angel sharing another message. Luke is saying this is a big deal. This is not any other angel sharing any other message. Okay. This is God like a human, not God as a human. Important difference, right? God as a human is whom? Jesus Christ. This is God like a human in a spiritual form. And this matters because what happens when a human enters into the unmitigated presence of God, the presence of God with no barrier? What happens? They die. They die. Yeah, they die. The scripture says it's not God killing somebody saying, "How dare you come into my presence?" It is because of our lack of holiness and God's complete holiness, our existence cannot continue in that moment. Okay, so through an angel, through a burning bush, through other things, God is communicating with the people. Do you see what I'm saying? God's presence is being shared with them without a mediator is necessary in this instance. So, those similarities can and should be drawn between this instance of an angel and Jesus, right? It's God like a human in this instance, and it's God as a human in the next. But this is more Old Testament authority being drawn here by Luke in the telling of the story. Okay, what this angel has to say then is not even just a message from Yahweh. This is Yahweh speaking. All right, that's enough about angels. Different course, different sermon series, whatever. But pretty much every time this kind of epiphany happens in our scripture, the human is overcome with fear. Understandable. No? I probably would be too.
Present day, when we think about an angel, we see an image of an individual with wings and so forth.
Right. Yeah, we see a precious moments character when we think of an angel.
So when the angel of the Lord appears somebody, is that the image they see?
Yeah, likely not. We see a bunch of different depictions. Like in Revelation, they have like multiple faces, and the few times that an angel is explicitly described, just the fact that, think about if it were a ghost to us today, that would terrify us, even if they appeared in human form, right? So to see a spiritual being that appears in some sort of, but they would have appeared in various forms, and they're not necessarily always described as to what specifically they looked like, right? And even in Revelation, you're seeing a vision from John, which that's, communicating something. So, but no, it most certainly and absolutely would not be our depiction of, a beautiful human with blonde hair and wings and a halo, right? But there are no such records of people fainting or crying with fear or things like that when they encounter Jesus. Of course not, right? He's a guy. You know what I mean? You wouldn't, walking down the street, you wouldn't be struck in that same way, would you? No, of course not, because it's not any different. I think that's where we'll need to cut it off for today. We talk about angels, we get to verse 11, and we'll continue. It's basically what we're going to get into now is Zechariah's response, right? That's where we're at. That's where we'll pick up next week. In let you know from there. There will be some dates coming up that I'll just communicate the best that I can to make sure everybody knows when we won't meet, but we'll be together for several weeks here and then move on from there. So thank you guys for joining us online. Thanks for being here in person. It's exciting to be back and talking about it and diving in a little bit. If you guys want to chat and ask questions or whatever, I'd be happy